The late afternoon sun beat down on the dusty main street of Alamosa, Colorado, and Julia Garrett stood in her small backyard, wrestling with a heavy quilt that seemed determined to catch every gust of wind that came off the distant mountains, nearly pulling her slight frame right off the ground with each powerful gale. It was September 1878, and the air carried that peculiar mix of lingering summer heat and the first whispers of autumn cold that made the high country such an unpredictable place to live. She had been airing her quilts for the better part of 2 hours, determined to freshen every single one before the harsh winter. Months descended upon the small town, nestled in the San Luis Valley. Julia had moved to Alamosa 6 months earlier after her husband, Thomas, had died suddenly from pneumonia, leaving her with nothing but a small house on the edge of town, a few pieces of furniture, and a collection of quilts her grandmother had made years ago back in Missouri. She was 23 years old and found herself completely alone in a territory that still felt raw and unsettled, where violence could erupt without warning, and where a woman alone was viewed with either suspicion or as prey for men with less than honorable intentions. The last quilt, a beautiful pattern of interlocking rings in deep blues and warm golds, finally cooperated enough for her to pin it securely to the clothesline. She stepped back, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand, and surveyed her work. 6 quilts now hung in a colorful display, flapping gently in the breeze like flags announcing something important, though Julia could not say what that might be. "That is quite a sight." The voice came from behind her, deep and measured, and Julia spun around so quickly she nearly lost her balance. A man stood at the edge of her property, one boot resting on the bottom rail of her fence, his hat tipped back just enough to reveal a face weathered by sun and wind. He was tall, probably in his mid-20s, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that seemed to reflect the Colorado sky above them. He wore dusty trail clothes and had a revolver strapped to his hip, but something about his posture suggested he was not looking for trouble. "I apologize for startling you, madam," he said, straightening up and touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "I did not mean to intrude on your privacy. I was just riding past and saw all those quilts, and I found myself stopping to admire them." Julia's heart was still racing, but she forced herself to take a calming breath. "You should not sneak up on people like that. A person could get hurt doing such things. You are absolutely right, and I apologize again." He smiled, and it transformed his entire face from stern to something approaching gentle. "My name is Gabriel Brennan. I just arrived in town about an hour ago, and I am looking for work. I heard there might be ranching opportunities in the valley." "Julia Garrett," she replied, still keeping a cautious distance. "And I would not know about ranching work. I keep to myself mostly." Gabriel nodded slowly, his gaze drifting back to the quilts. "Those are beautiful, really beautiful. My mother used to make quilts back before she passed. Seeing them hanging there like that, catching the light and the wind, it reminds me of home, of better times." There was something in his voice, a note of genuine loneliness that resonated with Julia's own feelings. She found herself relaxing slightly, though she kept her guard up. A woman alone could not afford to be too trusting. "They were my grandmother's work," Julia said. "I am just trying to air them out before winter comes. They have been packed away for too long and they smelled musty." "Stale," Gabriel said, almost to himself. He seemed lost in thought for a moment, then looked directly at Julia with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Everything in my life feels stale right now. I have been drifting from town to town, taking jobs that do not mean anything, sleeping in boarding houses and under the stars, never putting down roots anywhere. Seeing you standing here with those quilts, bringing something back to life, airing them out and making them fresh again. It made me think that maybe that is what I need, to air out my stale life somehow. Julia did not know what to say to such an honest confession. Most men she encountered were either crude or distant, keeping their feelings locked behind stoic expressions and terse words. This cowboy, this Gabriel Brennan, seemed different somehow. "That is a strange thing to say to a stranger," she finally managed. "I suppose it is," Gabriel agreed. "But sometimes strangers are the only ones we can be honest with. They have no expectations of us, no history to judge us by. They just see us as we are in that moment." A gust of wind picked up, causing the quilts to billow dramatically, and Julia had to move quickly to secure a corner that had come loose from its pin. Gabriel vaulted over the fence without asking permission and was beside her in an instant, reaching up to hold the quilt steady while she refastened it. "Thank you," Julia said, acutely aware of how close he was standing. She could smell horse and leather and something else, something clean like sage. "My pleasure, madam." He stepped back, giving her space again. "Listen, I know I am a stranger and you have no reason to trust me, but if you ever need help with anything around your property, I would be happy to lend a hand. No payment necessary, just the kindness of one lonely soul to another." Before Julia could respond, a voice called out from the street. "Hey, you there. What are you doing on that property?" Both Julia and Gabriel turned to see Sheriff Tom Randolph approaching, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. He was an older man, probably 50, with a thick mustache and suspicious eyes that seemed to see trouble everywhere. "Just helping the lady with her quilts, Sheriff," Gabriel called back, his tone respectful but not obsequious. "I do not recall asking you, Cowboy. I am asking Mrs. Garrett if you are bothering her." Julia felt a flash of irritation. Sheriff Randolph had been one of those men who viewed her widowhood as an opportunity, stopping by her house regularly under the guise of checking on her welfare, but always with an undertone of expectation that made her skin crawl. She knew he would like nothing better than to run this stranger out of town, thereby eliminating any potential competition for her attention. "He was helping me, Sheriff," Julia said firmly. "I appreciate your concern, but Mr. Brennan has been nothing but polite and helpful." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You just got into town, Brennan. I suggest you remember that we do not tolerate trouble here in Alamosa. We have had enough drifters cause problems." "I am not looking for trouble, Sheriff. Just honest work and a chance to settle down somewhere." "We will see about that." Sheriff Randolph turned his attention back to Julia. "Mrs. Garrett, I will be checking in on you later this week. Make sure you are managing all right." It was not a request, and Julia bristled at the presumption, but she simply nodded. Confronting the sheriff openly would do her no favors. The man walked away, casting one more warning glance at Gabriel before disappearing around the corner. "Seems like a friendly fellow," Gabriel said dryly. Despite herself, Julia laughed. "He means well, I suppose, in his way. He just does not approve of much, especially not of strangers talking to pretty widows, I would wager." Julia felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. "You should be careful, Mr. Brennan. The sheriff can make life difficult if he takes a dislike to someone." "I will keep that in mind." Gabriel moved back toward the fence, preparing to leave. "Thank you for the conversation, Mrs. Garrett. It was the most pleasant thing that has happened to me in quite some time." "Julia," she said impulsively. "You can call me Julia." His smile returned, lighting up his face. "Then you should call me Gabe. All my friends do. Or rather, all my friends used to back when I had more than a couple." "Where are you staying, Gabe?" "I got a room at the boarding house on 3rd Street, Mrs. Patterson's place." "She seems like a decent woman, even if her coffee could strip paint off a barn." Julia found herself smiling again, Her coffee is terrible, but her biscuits are good. I will remember that. Gabe tipped his hat again. Good evening, Julia. And if you meant what you said about me being helpful and polite, well, I meant what I said about lending a hand if you need it. I will be around town for a while, I think. Something tells me I should stay put here. He walked away, leading his horse, which Julia now noticed had been ground-tied a respectful distance from her property. She watched him go, feeling oddly unsettled by the encounter. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her like an actual person rather than an object to be pitied or pursued. Gabriel Brennan had treated her with respect, had shared something real about himself, and had not asked for anything in return except perhaps a moment of human connection. She turned back to her quilts, touching the edge of the one they had secured together. The fabric was warm from the sun and smelled fresh and clean, with no trace of that musty staleness that had permeated it before. She thought about what Gabe had said, about wanting to air out his stale life, and realized she understood exactly what he meant. Her life had felt stale too, ever since Thomas died. She had been going through the motions, surviving but not truly living, keeping herself locked away from the world just like these quilts had been locked away in her trunk. Maybe it was time to air things out. Over the next few days, Julia found herself thinking about Gabriel Brennan more often than she should. She saw him around town occasionally, always working at something. He had found employment with Martin Crawford, who owned one of the larger ranches outside town, and she would sometimes see him riding in with other ranch hands to pick up supplies or have a drink at the saloon. He always tipped his hat when he saw her, always gave her that genuine smile, but he never approached her directly or tried to force a conversation. Julia appreciated his discretion, even as part of her wished he would stop and talk with her again. She learned more about him through town gossip, which was the primary form of entertainment in Alamosa. Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house owner, apparently thought Gabe was a fine young man, very polite and tidy with his room. Mr. Crawford told anyone who would listen that his new hand was one of the best horsemen he had ever seen, and could work cattle like he had been born doing it. Even Sheriff Randolph seemed to have grudgingly accepted Gabe's presence, though Julia noticed he still watched the younger man with suspicious eyes whenever their paths crossed. 2 weeks after their first meeting, Julia was at the general store picking up supplies when she heard raised voices outside. She hurried to the window along with several other customers and saw a group of men gathered in the street, their postures aggressive. In the center of the group stood Gabe, his hands held loosely at his sides, his expression calm but alert. "I said you cheated, Brennan." One of the men was shouting. Julia recognized him as Hank Morrison, a local ranch hand with a reputation for drinking too much and starting fights. "Nobody can rope a steer that fast without cheating somehow." "I did not cheat, Morrison," Gabe said quietly. "I just did my job. If you want to be faster, then practice more. You calling me lazy, I am calling you drunk. Go home and sleep it off." Morrison lunged forward, fist raised, but Gabe sidestepped smoothly and caught the other man's arm, using his own momentum to send him sprawling into the dirt. 3 of Morrison's friends immediately moved forward, and Julia felt her heart jump into her throat. This was going to turn into a brawl, possibly worse if someone drew a weapon. But Sheriff Randolph appeared seemingly from nowhere, his gun drawn and his voice commanding. "That is enough. Morrison, get yourself home right now, or I will lock you up for disturbing the peace. The rest of you back away. There will be no fighting in my town." Morrison stumbled to his feet, glaring at Gabe with undisguised hatred. "This is not over, Brennan. It never happened to begin with," Gabe replied evenly. The crowd dispersed slowly, and Julia watched as the sheriff spoke briefly with Gabe, their conversation too quiet to hear. Then Gabe was walking away, and the sheriff was watching him go with that same suspicious expression he always wore. Julia finished her shopping quickly and headed home, her mind turning over what she had witnessed. Gabe had handled himself well, had not escalated the situation, had actually tried to defuse it. But Morrison was the vindictive type, and he had friends who were just as mean-spirited. Gabe could be in real danger if those men decided to pursue their grudge. She was surprised when, later that afternoon, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Gabe standing there, hat in hand, looking somewhat embarrassed. "Hello, Julia. I hope I am not intruding." "Not at all." "Please come in." She stepped back, suddenly very aware of how modest her home was. The main room served as both kitchen and sitting area, with simple furniture and those same quilts now decorating the walls and draped over the back of her one decent chair. Gabe entered slowly, looking around with evident appreciation. "You have made a real home here. It feels warm, lived in, comfortable." "Thank you. Please sit down. Would you like some coffee? It is not great, but it is better than Mrs. Patterson's." He laughed, and the sound filled the small space pleasantly. "That is not a high bar to clear, but yes, thank you. I would appreciate that." Julia busied herself with the coffee pot, grateful for something to do with her hands. "I saw what happened in town earlier. Are you all right?" "I am fine." Morrison is all bluster. He was embarrassed because Mr. Crawford praised my work in front of the other hands and his pride could not take it. Men like that need someone to blame for their own shortcomings. He has friends, though, mean friends. I know. I am not worried. Gabe accepted the cup she handed him and took a careful sip. "You were right. Much better than Mrs. Patterson's." Julia sat down across from him, cradling her own cup. "So why did you come by? Not that I mind, but I imagine you had a reason." "I did. I wanted to ask if you would have dinner with me tomorrow evening. There is a new restaurant that opened up last month, the Prairie Rose. I hear they make a decent steak." Julia felt her pulse quicken. "That sounds like you are asking to court me, Gabe." "I suppose I am." He met her eyes steadily. "I know it has not been long since your husband passed, and I do not want to be disrespectful to his memory. But I also know that life is short and uncertain, especially out here. When you find someone who makes you feel less alone in the world, you should not waste time pretending otherwise. From the moment I saw you with those quilts, fighting the wind and determined to make something old and stale fresh again, I felt something shift inside me. I would like to get to know you better, Julia, if you are willing." Julia's mind raced. Thomas had been gone for almost a year now. She had mourned him, had honored his memory, but she also knew he would not want her to spend the rest of her life alone. Thomas had been a practical man who believed in moving forward, not dwelling in the past. And the truth was, she felt something too when she was around Gabe. Something that made her feel alive again after months of merely existing. "I would like that," she said softly. "Yes, I will have dinner with you tomorrow." Gabe's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Thank you. I will pick you up at 6 o'clock if that suits you." "That suits me fine." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Julia, I meant what I said that first day, about wanting to air out my stale life. You make me feel like I can do that. Like maybe I can stop drifting and start actually living somewhere, building something real. I just wanted you to know that." After he left, Julia stood in her quiet house, feeling the walls seemed less confining than they had before. She looked at her quilts, at the colors and patterns her grandmother had created with such care and skill, and thought about how those old pieces of fabric had brought Gabe into her life. Sometimes the smallest actions led to the most profound changes. The next day seemed to drag on forever. Julia found herself changing her dress 3 times before settling on a simple but flattering blue cotton with white lace at the collar and cuffs. She pinned her dark hair up carefully, allowing a few curls to frame her face, and even dabbed a little rose water on her wrists. She felt foolish being so nervous about a dinner, but she also felt excited in a way she had not experienced in a very long time. Gabe arrived exactly at 6, dressed in clean clothes with his hair neatly combed and his boots polished. He offered her his arm, and they walked together toward the center of town, drawing looks from several people they passed. Julia knew tongues would be wagging by morning, but she found she did not care as much as she thought she would. The Prairie Rose was a modest establishment, but it was clean and welcoming, with red checked tablecloths and oil lamps that cast a warm glow over everything. The owner, a sturdy woman named Margaret Chen, whose father had been Chinese and mother Scottish, greeted them warmly and showed them to a table near the window. "I am glad you brought Mrs. Garrett here, Mr. Brennan," Margaret said with a knowing smile. "She deserves a nice evening out. And you picked the right night. My husband made his special beef stew and we have fresh bread and apple pie." "That sounds perfect," Gabe said. As they ate, they talked. Really talked in a way Julia had not talked with anyone in months. Gabe told her about growing up in Texas, about his parents who had died when he was 18, leaving him alone and adrift. He had worked cattle drives, had been a ranch hand across 3 territories, had seen violent things and beautiful things and everything in between. But through it all, he said, he had felt like he was waiting for something, searching for something he could not name. Julia shared her own story. Growing up in Missouri, meeting Thomas when she was 19, the quick courtship and marriage, the decision to move west for better opportunities. Thomas's death just 2 months after they arrived in Colorado, leaving her stranded in a place where she knew no one and had no family to fall back on. The struggle to survive alone, the loneliness that sometimes felt like it would swallow her whole. "I stopped living after Thomas died," she admitted. "I was just going through motions, waiting for something to happen but not doing anything to make it happen. Those quilts sitting in that trunk, getting stale and musty, that was like my life. Packed away and forgotten, not being used for anything." "But you took them out," Gabe said. "You aired them out and brought them back to life. That took courage, Julia. It means you are ready to live again, not just exist." "I think maybe I am, or at least I want to be." He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "Then let us air out our stale lives together. Let us be brave enough to take what life is offering us right now in this moment and see where it leads." Julia felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came from feeling understood and seen and valued. "I would like that very much." They lingered over dinner, talking and laughing, and Julia felt something inside her unfurl like those quilts catching the wind. She was coming back to life, and it was both terrifying and exhilarating. When Gabe walked her home, they moved slowly, neither wanting the evening to end. At her door, he hesitated, then leaned down and kissed her forehead gently. "Thank you for tonight, Julia, for giving me a chance." "Thank you for asking," she replied, "for seeing me as someone worth asking." "You are worth everything good in this world," he said seriously. "I hope you know that." After he left, Julia went inside and immediately wrote a letter to her sister back in Missouri. She had not written in months, having nothing good to report, but now she found she had so much to say. She wrote about Gabe, about feeling hopeful again, about daring to imagine a future that held more than just loneliness and struggle. The courtship moved quickly after that, but it never felt rushed. Gabe came by every evening after work, often helping Julia with tasks around her property. He fixed her sagging fence, patched her roof where it was starting to leak, and split enough firewood to see her through the winter. They took long walks together, exploring the valley and talking about everything and nothing. Julia learned that Gabe could quote poetry, that he had taught himself to read as a teenager, that he dreamed of one day owning his own ranch where he could raise horses. Julia shared her own dreams, things she had pushed aside after Thomas died. She wanted to open a shop someday, selling quilts and other handmade goods. She wanted to have children, to fill a house with noise and laughter and life. She wanted to matter to someone, to be essential to their happiness the way they were essential to hers. "You already matter," Gabe told her one evening as they sat on her small porch watching the sun set over the mountains. "You matter to me more than I can properly express. You have given me something to work toward, a reason to build instead of just drift. When I wake up in the morning now, I have purpose because I know I will see you at the end of the day. That is not a small thing, Julia. That is everything." But their happiness was not without obstacles. Sheriff Randolph made his disapproval clear, stopping by Julia's house one afternoon when he knew Gabe would be there. "Mrs. Garrett, I need to speak with you. Privately." Gabe started to step away, but Julia caught his hand. "Whatever you have to say to me, Sheriff, you can say in front of Gabe." The sheriff's face darkened. "Fine. I will be blunt then. You are making a fool of yourself with this drifter. He will break your heart and leave you worse off than you are now. Men like him do not settle down. They just use up what they can get and move on to the next town, the next woman." "You do not know anything about me, Sheriff," Gabe said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "I know your type. I have been wearing this badge for 15 years, and I have seen hundreds of cowboys just like you come through this town. Not one of them ever amounted to anything permanent." "Then I will be the first," Gabe replied, "because I am not going anywhere. I love Julia and I intend to marry her if she will have me. You can approve or not, but it will not change anything." Julia's heart nearly stopped. They had not spoken of marriage yet, though she had felt it hovering unspoken between them. Hearing Gabe say it out loud, declare it so clearly and firmly, made it real in a way that took her breath away. The sheriff looked between them, and something in his expression shifted from disapproval to resignation. "Mrs. Garrett, is this what you want?" "Yes," Julia said firmly. "This is exactly what I want." "Then I suppose there is nothing more to say." "But Brennan, if you hurt her, if you prove me right and break her heart, you will answer to me. Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear. But you will never have that satisfaction because I will never hurt her." After the sheriff left, Julia and Gabe stood together in silence for a long moment. Then Julia turned to face him fully. "Did you mean it? About marriage? Every word? I know we have not been courting long by conventional standards, but nothing about my life has ever been conventional. I know what I feel, Julia. I know you are the person I want to wake up next to for the rest of my life. I know I want to build a home with you, raise a family with you, grow old with you. If you need more time to be sure, I will give you that time, but I am already sure." Julia thought about Thomas, about the life they had planned but never got to live. She thought about grief and loss and all the reasons people used to protect themselves from being hurt. And then she thought about those quilts, about taking them out of storage and letting them catch the wind and sun, about breathing fresh life into something that had been packed away and forgotten. "I do not need more time," she said. "I am sure too. Yes, Gabe, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and Julia felt like she had finally come home after a long journey through difficult terrain. They stood there as the light faded and the first stars appeared, making promises to each other in whispers and touches and the simple fact of being together. They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church on the edge of town. Margaret Chen helped Julia make a new dress, a beautiful creation in cream-colored silk with delicate embroidery at the hem. Julia wore her grandmother's locket and carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that Gabe had picked himself that morning. Mr. Crawford stood up as Gabe's witness, and Margaret stood for Julia. A surprising number of townspeople attended, including Sheriff Randolph, who seemed to have made peace with the situation even if he still had reservations. Mrs. Patterson cried through the entire ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief and declaring it was the most romantic thing she had seen in years. After the ceremony, there was a celebration at the Prairie Rose. Margaret and her husband had prepared a feast, and someone had brought a fiddle, and there was dancing and laughter and joy. Julia felt like she was floating through it all, anchored only by Gabe's hand in hers, his eyes always finding her across the room, his smile telling her without words how happy he was. That night, in the small house that was now their home together, Gabe carried Julia over the threshold and set her down gently in the main room where her grandmother's quilts hung on every wall, creating a cocoon of color and warmth. "I have something for you," he said, pulling a small wrapped package from his coat pocket. "I wanted to wait until we were alone to give it to you." Julia unwrapped it carefully and found a beautiful silver hairbrush with her initials engraved on the back. But they were not the initials she had carried for most of her life. They were her new initials, JB, Julia Brennan. "It is beautiful," she whispered, tracing the letters with her finger. "You are beautiful," Gabe replied, "inside and out." You took a drifting cowboy with a stale life and showed him what it means to really live. You are the bravest person I know, Julia. You lost everything and still found the courage to try again, to open your heart to someone new. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that courage." "You already are," Julia said, setting the brush aside and stepping into his arms. "You already are." Their first months of marriage were a time of adjustment and discovery. Gabe continued working for Mr. Crawford, but he was now saving money with purpose, planning for the future. He wanted to buy land, start his own ranch, build something permanent that would last beyond their lifetimes. Julia supported his dream completely, and she pursued her own as well, making quilts in the evenings and beginning to sell them to people in town and travelers passing through. Winter came hard and early that year, covering the valley in snow and dropping temperatures so low that water froze in the basin overnight. But Julia and Gabe were warm in their small house, wrapped in those aired-out quilts, building a life together piece by piece. They talked for hours about everything under the sun. Gabe taught Julia how to shoot, insisting she should know how to protect herself if he was ever away. Julia taught Gabe how to cook more than just campfire basics, and they spent evenings experimenting with recipes and laughing at their failures. They read to each other from the few books they owned, sharing favorite passages and debating meanings. It was not always easy. They had their disagreements, their moments of frustration and hurt feelings. But they had also learned from their pasts, had both known real loss, and that knowledge made them more willing to work through difficulties rather than let them fester. One night in February, during a particularly vicious blizzard, they lay together under a pile of quilts listening to the wind howl outside. Julia rested her head on Gabe's chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. "You ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Settling down, giving up that drifting life?" "Not for a single second," Gabe replied immediately. "That was not living, Julia. That was just marking time, waiting to die. This is living. Waking up next to you, working toward something that matters, knowing I have a home to come back to at the end of every day. This is what I was searching for all those years without even knowing it. I feel the same way. Sometimes I feel guilty about it, being this happy when Thomas is gone. But I think he would want this for me. He was not a selfish man. He would want me to live fully, not just exist. Then that is what we will do. We will live fully for ourselves and for everyone who did not get the chance. We will build something good and real and lasting. Spring brought change. Mr. Crawford, who had taken a genuine liking to Gabe, offered to sell him a parcel of land on favorable terms. It was 200 acres of good grassland with a creek running through it, perfect for raising horses and cattle. The price was more than fair, and Crawford agreed to let Gabe pay over time as he could manage. Julia was thrilled. This was the beginning of everything they had dreamed about. They spent their free time walking the property, making plans, imagining where they would build a real house, where the barns would go, how they would lay out the corrals and pastures. Building a ranch from nothing was backbreaking work. Gabe worked for Crawford during the day and spent evenings and weekends on his own land. Julia helped whenever she could, though Gabe often insisted she rest, especially after she told him she was pregnant in late June. "I am not made of glass," she protested when he tried to stop her from helping dig post holes for a fence. "Women have been having babies and working right up until delivery since the beginning of time." "I know, but you are my wife and that is my child, and I will worry whether you like it or not." Julia laughed and kissed him. "Then worry. But let me help anyway. We are building this together, remember? Equal partners." The pregnancy progressed well. Julia felt healthy and strong if occasionally tired. She continued making quilts, now creating small ones suitable for a baby, using soft fabrics in cheerful colors. Margaret Chen threw a small party for her, and the women of Alamosa, who had slowly warmed to Julia over the months, brought gifts and advice and stories of their own pregnancies. Even Sheriff Randolph seemed to have fully accepted the situation. He stopped by one day while Gabe was at work and found Julia in the garden. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, using her married name for the first time Julia could remember. "I wanted to apologize for how I acted when you and Gabe first started courting. I was wrong about him. He is a good man and he makes you happy. That is what matters." "Thank you, Sheriff. That means a great deal to me. I also wanted to tell you that if you ever need anything at all, you can count on me. You and your family are part of this community now, and we take care of our own." It was a small thing, perhaps, but it felt significant. Julia was no longer an outsider, no longer viewed with suspicion or pity. She had a place here, a real home, and people who cared about her well-being. The baby arrived in early March of 1880, during a late-season snowstorm. Dr. Harrison, the town physician, made it to the house in time, and Margaret Chen came to assist. Gabe paced outside, too nervous to stay in the room but too worried to go far. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Julia thought she could not endure another minute of it. But then she would hear Gabe's voice through the door, calling encouragement, and she would find the strength to push through. Finally, as dawn broke and the snow began to taper off, their son was born. He came into the world screaming his displeasure, red-faced and furious, and Julia fell immediately and completely in love. "You have a healthy boy," Dr. Harrison announced, allowing Gabe to finally enter the room. Gabe approached the bed slowly, his eyes wide with wonder. Julia held their son out to him, and he took the tiny bundle with shaking hands. "He is perfect," Gabe whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Julia, he is perfect." "What should we name him?" Julia asked, exhausted but happier than she had ever been. Gabe thought for a moment. "Thomas," he said finally. "We should name him Thomas after your first husband. He was part of bringing you here, part of the path that led to us. That should be honored." Julia felt tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of joy and gratitude for this man who understood her heart so completely. "Thomas Gabriel Brennan," she said. That sounds right. Life with a newborn was chaotic and exhausting and wonderful. Thomas was a demanding baby who seemed to need constant attention, but neither Julia nor Gabe minded. They took turns walking him when he would not sleep, sang to him, marveled at every tiny change in his expression and movements. The ranch was progressing slowly but steadily. Gabe had managed to purchase a small herd of horses, and he was building a reputation as a skilled trainer. People from neighboring ranches started seeking him out, paying him to work with difficult horses or to break new ones. The additional income helped tremendously, allowing them to hire occasional help with the heavy construction work. Julia's quilt business was also thriving. She had more orders than she could keep up with, and she was training several other women in town, creating a small cooperative where they shared work and profits. It gave them all a sense of purpose and independence that was rare for women in the territory. By the time Thomas was walking and beginning to talk, the ranch had a proper house, a barn, and several corrals. It was not fancy, but it was solid and well built, designed to last generations. Julia spent hours decorating their new home, hanging her quilts on the walls and making curtains and cushions. She planted a garden and flowers, softening the raw edges of new construction. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their new house watching Thomas toddle around the yard chasing a butterfly, Gabe turned to Julia with a serious expression. "You remember that first day, when I saw you airing those quilts?" "Of course I remember. How could I forget?" "I said something to you about wanting to air out my stale life." "You said you wanted to air out your stale life with mine," Julia corrected gently. "That is right. And I have been thinking about that lately, about how strange that must have sounded to you at the time." "But Julia, that is exactly what happened. My life was stale, going nowhere, just the same things over and over with no meaning. And then I saw you and everything changed. You brought freshness and purpose and joy into my existence. You aired out all the stale parts and replaced them with something vibrant and alive." Julia reached over and took his hand. "You did the same for me. I was existing, not living, going through motions but not feeling anything real. You made me brave enough to try again, to open my heart even though it had been broken. You showed me that life is for living, not for hiding from." "We saved each other," Gabe said simply. "Yes, we did." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their son explore his world with the fearless curiosity of toddlerhood. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and one of their horses answered with a soft whinny. "I love you, Julia Brennan," Gabe said. "More today than yesterday, and I will love you more tomorrow than today. That is my promise to you. And I love you, Gabriel Brennan, for as long as I draw breath and beyond." The years that followed were full and rich. They had 2 more children, a daughter they named Grace and another son they named Samuel. The ranch prospered, growing to nearly 500 acres with a substantial herd of both horses and cattle. Gabe became known throughout Colorado as one of the finest horsemen in the territory, and people would travel days to buy horses he had trained. Julia's quilt cooperative expanded to include more than a dozen women, and their goods were sold as far away as Denver. She opened a small shop in town, run mostly by Margaret Chen's daughter, where they sold not just quilts, but also other handcrafted items. It became a gathering place for women in the community, a spot where they could socialize and share news and support each other. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the ranch and spent every spare moment following his father around, learning everything he could about horses and cattle and the land. Grace was more artistic, preferring to help her mother with quilting and drawing elaborate pictures of the world around her. Samuel, the youngest, was pure energy and mischief, keeping everyone on their toes and making them laugh with his antics. Through it all, Julia and Gabe remained each other's anchors. They made time for each other despite the demands of work and children, still taking evening walks when they could, still talking for hours about everything and nothing. They weathered hard times together, including a terrible winter that killed part of their herd and a summer drought that tested their resources. But they always came through stronger, their bond deepening with each challenge overcome. The town of Alamosa grew and changed around them. The railroad arrived, bringing more people and more opportunities. The rough edges of frontier life began to smooth out as civilization crept westward. But some things remained constant. The mountains standing eternal watch over the valley, the crisp, clean air, the sense of space and possibility that defined the West. Sheriff Randolph retired and was replaced by a younger man. Though Randolph still lived in town and often stopped by the ranch to visit, having become a genuine friend over the years. Mr. Crawford passed away and left a portion of his ranch to Gabe in his will, recognizing the young man he had given a chance to years before. Mrs. Patterson sold her boarding house and moved back east to live with her sister, but not before making Julia promise to write regularly with news of the children. Margaret Chen's restaurant became a fixture in town, a place where Julia and Gabe celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, where they gathered with friends for special occasions, where Margaret always had a kind word and a warm meal ready. Julia never forgot her first husband Thomas, but the pain of his loss faded into something softer, more like a bittersweet memory than an open wound. She kept a photograph of him on the mantel, and she would sometimes tell their son stories about the man he was named after, wanting to honor that part of her history without letting it overshadow her present. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Gabe surprised Julia by taking her back to that spot where they had first met, where her small house still stood though they no longer lived there. He had arranged for the children to stay with Margaret for the night, giving them rare time alone. "I wanted to come back here," Gabe explained as they stood in the yard where Julia had once fought with quilts in the wind. "I wanted to remember where we started, so we never take for granted where we are now." Julia looked around, seeing the place with fresh eyes. The fence Gabe had repaired all those years ago still stood straight and strong. The porch where they had sat and talked through those early days of courtship looked smaller than she remembered but no less significant. "You know what I remember most about that day?" Julia asked. "Not just seeing you, though that was memorable enough, but the feeling I had when you talked about your stale life. I felt like someone had finally put words to something I could not articulate. My life was stale too, and I had not even realized it until you said it. You gave me permission to want more, to reach for more." "We gave each other permission," Gabe corrected. "You were already taking the first steps when I met you, airing out those quilts. That was symbolic. You were ready to change even if you did not consciously know it yet." They walked to where the clothesline had once stood. It was gone now, rotted away and removed years ago. But Julia could still see it in her mind's eye, could still feel the weight of those quilts in her hands, could still remember the exact moment Gabe had appeared and changed the trajectory of her entire life. "If I could go back and tell that younger version of myself what was coming," Julia said thoughtfully, "I would tell her that it is worth it. All the fear and uncertainty and risk, it is worth it for what comes after." "What comes after?" Gabe asked, pulling her close. "This, you, our children. Our life. All of it. Every single bit of it." He kissed her then, deeply and tenderly, and Julia felt the same spark she had felt on their wedding night, proof that passion did not have to fade with time, that love could continue to grow and evolve and surprise you even after years together. They stayed at the old house that night, sleeping in the small bedroom that had once been Julia's entire world. In the morning, they returned to their ranch, to their children, to the life they had built together from nothing but hope and hard work and stubborn determination to make something good from difficult circumstances. As the children grew older, they began to understand more about their parents' story. Thomas, now a teenager, asked questions about his namesake, and Julia told him honestly about her first marriage, about the love she had shared with his father's predecessor, about loss and grief, and the courage it takes to try again. "Were you scared?" Thomas asked, "when you decided to marry Papa?" "Scared that you would lose him too." "Terrified," Julia admitted. "But I was more scared of spending my whole life hiding from that possibility. Your father taught me that living in fear is not really living at all." "Papa is brave," Thomas said, in that matter-of-fact way teenagers have of stating things they have always known but only recently understood. "Your papa is very brave. But so are you, and so am I, and so is everyone who gets up every morning and chooses to keep going despite all the reasons they might have to give up. That is the kind of bravery that builds lives and families and communities." Grace, artistic and intuitive, seemed to understand their story on a deeper level without needing to ask many questions. She created a quilt as a gift for their 15th anniversary, using pieces of fabric from Julia's original quilts, the ones that had been airing on the line that fateful day. The new quilt incorporated the old patterns, but arranged them in fresh ways, creating something that honored the past while being wholly new and original. "It is perfect," Julia whispered when Grace presented it to her, recognizing immediately what her daughter had done. "Grace, this is the most thoughtful gift I have ever received. You and Papa always talk about airing out your stale lives," Grace explained. "I wanted to show that you can take old things and make them new again, that nothing is ever really lost if you find creative ways to preserve it." Gabe held the quilt carefully, studying the intricate work his daughter had put into it. "You have your mother's talent and her heart. We are so proud of you, Grace." Samuel, now 10 years old and still full of boundless energy, was less interested in the deeper meanings and more interested in practical matters. "When I grow up, I want to run the ranch," he announced. "Thomas can have it first since he is oldest, but then I get a turn. And Grace can make quilts in the house we build for her on the north pasture." "You have it all figured out, do you?" Gabe asked, amused. "Yes. And when I run the ranch, I am going to have the fastest horses in all of Colorado, maybe all of America." "That is a fine goal, son. Dream big." As the 1890s approached, bringing with them the official close of the frontier era, Julia and Gabe found themselves becoming elders in the community, people that younger families came to for advice and support. Their ranch had become something of a landmark, and their story was told to newcomers as an example of what could be built with determination and love. Julia's quilts had become collectors' items, with people willing to pay substantial sums for her work. But she still made them primarily as acts of love, creating quilts for each of her children's eventual weddings, for the births of grandchildren, for friends going through difficult times. Gabe's horses were known throughout the West, and he had trained several that went on to win major competitions and become foundation stock for new bloodlines. But he never lost his connection to the work itself, still preferring to spend his days with the horses rather than handling the business side of things. On quiet evenings, they would sit together on the porch of their house, the same way they had done for decades, watching the sun set over mountains that never changed even as everything around them did. You ever think about how different things could have been? Julia asked one such evening. If you had ridden past my house that day without stopping, if you had not seen the quilts or decided not to introduce yourself. I think about it sometimes, Gabe admitted, and it terrifies me. So many small decisions that led to this moment. If I had taken a job in a different town, if you had decided not to air the quilts that particular day, if I had been too shy to speak to you, our entire life together hangs on a thread of coincidences. I do not think it was coincidence, Julia said firmly. I think it was meant to be. The universe, or God, or fate, whatever you want to call it, sometimes it puts people in each other's paths at exactly the right moment. We were both ready, both open to the possibility of change, and that created a space for something beautiful to happen. You make it sound poetic. It is poetic. Love is poetry. Building a life together is poetry. All of this, she gestured at the ranch, at the mountains, at the gathering dusk. This is poetry written in actions instead of words. Gabe leaned over and kissed her temple. You have always been the dreamer in this relationship. I just provided the practical support for your dreams to come true. You provided far more than that. You provided partnership, respect, love that never wavered even when things were hard. You provided security that allowed me to take risks. You provided the foundation on which everything else was built. They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. From inside the house, they could hear the sounds of their family. Thomas talking with Samuel about ranch matters, Grace singing softly as she worked on some project, the ordinary sounds of a life well lived. We did it, Gabe said softly. We aired out our stale lives and built something fresh and good. We did it together, Julia corrected. That was always the key, together. Thomas was the first to marry, at 22, to a local girl named Catherine who had grown up on a neighboring ranch. The wedding was a grand affair by Alamosa standards, with what seemed like half the town in attendance. Julia and Gabe watched their oldest son speak his vows, and Julia could not help but see both her late husband and her current one in Thomas's face and bearing. He is going to be fine, Gabe whispered during the ceremony, as if reading her thoughts. We raised him right. He knows how to love and work and build. That is all any parent can hope to give their children. Grace married at 20, to a banker from Denver named Frederick who appreciated her artistic nature and supported her quilting business. The match surprised everyone, but it worked beautifully. Grace never left the ranch entirely, maintaining a studio there even as she and Frederick built a life in the city. Samuel, true to his childhood declaration, stayed at the ranch and eventually took over daily operations, allowing Gabe to step back gradually into a more advisory role. He married at 25 to a teacher named Abigail who brought her own strength and wisdom to the family. Together, they had 3 children in quick succession, filling the ranch with a new generation of noise and laughter. As grandchildren arrived, Julia and Gabe found themselves entering a new phase of life. They had more time for each other again, their days less consumed by the immediate demands of young children and building a business from nothing. They traveled some, visiting Denver and even taking a train trip to San Francisco, but they always returned gratefully to their ranch in the valley, to the place they had built together. I never thought I would live this long, Gabe confessed one morning as they walked slowly around the property, moving at the pace of people in their 60s who had lived hard-working lives. I always assumed I would die young, caught in a stampede or thrown from a horse or in some saloon fight. I never imagined this. What? A peaceful old age surrounded by family, exactly that. It seemed like something for other people, not for a drifter with no prospects. You were never without prospects, Julia argued. You just had not found the right place to use them yet. Everyone has value, Gabe. Not everyone finds the circumstances where their value can shine, but that does not mean it is not there. He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. You have always seen the best in people, in me especially. I do not know what I did to deserve you, Julia Brennan, but I thank God every day that you took a chance on a dusty cowboy who said strange things about airing out stale lives. It was not strange. It was honest. And honesty is the rarest and most valuable thing in this world. They continued their walk, eventually ending up back at the house where their daughter-in-law was teaching their grandchildren to quilt, using pieces of fabric from Julia's ever-growing collection. The sight made Julia's heart swell with joy and satisfaction. This continuity, this passing down of skills and traditions and love, this was immortality in the most real sense. Years continued to pass, marked by seasons and celebrations and the ordinary rhythms of ranch life. Julia and Gabe aged gracefully, their bodies slowing but their minds and hearts remaining sharp. They dealt with the losses that come with long life, attending funerals for friends like Margaret Chen and Sheriff Randolph, saying goodbye to the last links to their younger days. But there were joys too. More grandchildren, eventually great-grandchildren, each one a small miracle. Thomas took over completely as head of the family, managing the ranch and its associated businesses with skill and fairness. Grace's quilts ended up in museums and private collections across the country. Samuel expanded the horse breeding program into something truly remarkable, creating bloodlines that would endure for generations. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the family organized a massive celebration at the ranch. It seemed like everyone they had ever known attended, along with many people they knew only by reputation. There were speeches and toasts, music and dancing, food enough to feed a small army. But Julia's favorite moment came late in the evening, when most of the guests had departed and only family remained. Gabe stood up, his movements slower than they once were but still sure, and raised his glass. 40 years ago, I married the most remarkable woman I have ever known. I was a nobody cowboy with nothing to offer but a willingness to work hard and a heart that knew it had found its home. Julia took a chance on me, let me air out my stale life alongside hers, and together we built all of this. He gestured at the gathered family, at the ranch visible through the windows. Every good thing in my life came from that decision she made to say yes. So this toast is not to our marriage, though that has been a blessing. This toast is to Julia, to her courage and her heart and her wisdom. To my wife, my partner, my love. Thank you for 40 years. I only wish I could promise you 40 more. Everyone drank, and there were tears on many faces. Julia stood and kissed her husband, not caring who was watching, not caring that they were old and surrounded by their children and grandchildren. Love did not diminish with age. If anything, it grew deeper and more precious. Thank you for seeing me, Julia said softly, just for Gabe to hear. For really seeing me, right from that very first day. Thank you for choosing me as much as I chose you. Thank you for every day of these 40 years. As they stood together, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had built, Julia thought back to that young woman airing quilts on a clothesline, fighting the wind and feeling so alone in the world. She wished she could go back and tell that woman that everything would be all right, that the cowboy who stopped to admire her work would become her entire world, that from that simple moment would spring more joy and love than she could possibly imagine. But of course, that was impossible. That young woman had to take her own risks, make her own leaps of faith, be her own kind of brave. And she had been. They both had been. Gabe and Julia lived to see their golden anniversary, though by then both were fragile, their bodies worn out by decades of hard work and simple age. The celebration was smaller and quieter than the previous milestone, held at the house with just immediate family present. 50 years, Gabe marveled, holding Julia's hand as they sat together in chairs specially positioned so they could see the mountains through the window. Half a century of loving you. It went so fast, Julia. I feel like we just started and now here we are at the end. Not the end, Julia protested softly. Never the end. Love does not end, Gabe. It transforms, but it does not end. When we are gone, we will live on in our children and grandchildren, in the ranch we built, in the quilts I made, in the horses you trained. We will live on in the story people tell about the cowboy and the widow who aired out their stale lives together and built something beautiful. You always were better with words than me. No, you were always perfectly eloquent when it mattered. You told me exactly what I needed to hear that first day, and you have been doing it ever since. Gabe passed quietly in his sleep 6 months after their golden anniversary, simply failing to wake one morning. Julia found him looking peaceful, his face relaxed in a way it rarely was in life, and though her heart broke, she also felt grateful. They had had 50 glorious years together, which was more than many people got. He had not suffered, had not lingered in pain. He had simply moved on to whatever came next. The funeral was one of the largest Alamosa had ever seen. Gabe had been a pillar of the community, respected and loved by everyone who knew him. People told stories about his kindness, his skill with horses, his devotion to his family, his quiet dignity. Julia listened to it all with tears streaming down her face, but also with pride. This was her husband they were celebrating, the man who had seen her airing quilts and had the courage to stop and speak to her. After the funeral, Thomas tried to convince Julia to come live with him and Catherine in the main house, but Julia refused. "I want to stay in the house your father and I built," she insisted. "I want to be surrounded by our memories, by the life we created together. I am not afraid to be alone, Thomas. I have been alone before and I survived it. I will survive this too." And she did survive, though there were days when the grief felt overwhelming. She found comfort in her quilts, in her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in the rhythms of ranch life continuing around her. She told stories about Gabe to anyone who would listen, determined that he would not be forgotten, that the younger generations would know the man their family had been built on. Julia lived for 3 more years after Gabe's death, growing progressively frailer but remaining mentally sharp until the very end. She spent her final days surrounded by family, drifting in and out of consciousness, sometimes speaking to people who could not answer back because they had been dead for years. "The quilts," she said in one of her last coherent moments, speaking to Grace who sat beside her bed. "Make sure the quilts are preserved. They are important. They are where it all started." "I will, Mama, I promise." "And tell the story. Tell people about the cowboy who wanted to air out his stale life. Tell them that love is worth the risk, that opening your heart even after it has been broken is the bravest thing anyone can do. Tell them that my life was stale until Gabe came into it, and together we made it fresh and beautiful. Promise me you will tell that story." "I promise, Mama." "We will all tell it. Your story will live on." Julia smiled, satisfied. "Good, that is all I need, that and to see him again. I miss him so much, Grace, every single day." "I know, Mama, but you will see him soon, and he will be waiting for you." Julia passed peacefully that night, in the house she and Gabe had built, under quilts she had made with her own hands. Her children and grandchildren were with her, holding her hands and speaking words of love and comfort. She died as she had lived in her later years, surrounded by the family that was her greatest achievement. They buried her next to Gabe on a hill overlooking the ranch, under trees they had planted together decades before. The double headstone was simple. Gabriel Brennan, beloved husband and father, and Julia Brennan, beloved wife and mother. But those simple words did not come close to capturing what they had been to each other and to the community they had helped build. The ranch continued under Thomas's management, then passed to Samuel's children, generation after generation keeping it alive and thriving. Grace's quilts, especially the original ones that Julia had been airing that fateful day, were eventually donated to a museum where they were preserved and displayed as examples of frontier craftsmanship and artistry. But more importantly, the story was preserved. It was told and retold, passed down through the family and shared with friends and neighbors. The story of a widow airing quilts on a clothesline and a cowboy who stopped to admire them. The story of two lonely people who found each other at exactly the right moment and had the courage to build a life together. The story of stale lives being aired out and made fresh through love and partnership and determination. In the end, that was their real legacy. Not the ranch, though that endured. Not the quilts, though those were preserved. Not even the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their blood and their names. Their real legacy was the story itself, the proof that love could bloom in unexpected places, that it was never too late to start over, that two people working together could build something that lasted long after they were gone. And every time someone told that story, every time they spoke of the cowboy who wanted to air out his stale life with the widow's fresh one, Gabriel and Julia Brennan lived again, their love as vibrant and real as it had been on that September day in 1878, when everything changed with a simple conversation beside a clothesline full of quilts dancing in the Colorado wind. The years turned into decades, and still the story persisted. Great-great-grandchildren would visit the museum to see the quilts, would walk the land their ancestors had claimed and tamed, would stand by the graves on the hill and try to imagine what it must have been like to be so brave, to risk everything on love when there were no guarantees of success. The ranch eventually became a historical site, preserved as an example of how families had built lives in the American West during those uncertain years when the frontier was closing and the modern world was beginning. Tour guides would tell Julia and Gabe's story to visitors who came from all over the world to see what had been created from nothing but hard work and love. And always, the central image of their story remained the same: quilts on a clothesline, a woman determined to air out things that had been packed away too long, a cowboy brave enough to stop and speak the truth of his own stale life, and the conversation that changed both their lives forever. It was a simple story, really. No grand adventures or dramatic rescues, no violence or tragedy beyond the ordinary sorrows that come to all lives. Just two people who recognized something in each other, who had the courage to act on that recognition, and who worked every day to build and maintain what they had created together. But perhaps that was what made it such a powerful story. It was achievable. It was real. It proved that extraordinary lives could be built from ordinary beginnings, that love was not just for the young and beautiful and wealthy, but for anyone brave enough to reach for it. And so the story lived on, passed down through generations, inspiring others to take their own risks, to air out their own stale lives, to believe that happiness and love and fulfillment were possible even after loss, even after heartbreak, even when everything seemed impossible. Julia and Gabe would have been amazed and perhaps a bit embarrassed by the legacy they left. They never thought of themselves as special or remarkable. They were just two people trying to make a life in a hard land, loving each other as best they could, raising their children with care and teaching them the values they held dear. But that was the beauty of it. They were ordinary people who created something extraordinary through the simple act of choosing love every single day. They aired out their stale lives together, and in doing so, they created something fresh and beautiful that endured long after their bodies had returned to the earth and only their story remained. And that, in the end, was more than enough. It was everything.